We do encourage audience participation, so please do submit your questions if you have any via the GLOBSEC app or the old-fashioned way, raise your hand. I'd like to talk a little bit more about this Marshall Plan concept, right? Because the original Marshall Plan funds were more than 90% grants and less than 10% loans. So what sort of shape should or can rebuilding assistance to Ukraine take? You know, there's been calls for Western powers to guarantee Ukrainian government bonds, for example, but that would leave Ukraine more heavily indebted. So, Arup, if I can come to you, what options are available and how can multilaterals, DFIs, governments, and the private sector work together?
Thank you, and such a pleasure to be here with this panel. Look, I think, let me talk about two things. First, the Marshall Plan concept, right? You're exactly right that the Marshall Plan was mostly about grants and a little on loans, and that actually was tremendously important in the short years, the 4 years that the Marshall Plan was actually enacted to bring forth some of the change for Western Europe at that time. But it's also important to remember, as people like Barry Eichengreen has reminded us, that the most important part of the Marshall Plan was actually the transfer of technology. What the Marshall Plan did was really form a strong partnership between the US at that time and Western Europe that brought technology, very much as Taras, you've talked about, right? Bring the technology, bring the ideas, bring the modern ways of doing business, bring the efficiency to Western Europe to enable it to grow on its own. So a huge part, and I'll talk a bit about the mix of foreign assistance, but a huge part of what I think the global community needs to help Ukraine with is the vision that Taras talked about, to help build Ukraine's own self-sufficiency, to help Ukraine have the resources, the revenues that can actually help it grow and restore itself to an economic powerhouse. Now, what about the loans versus grants storyline that you asked about? You're absolutely right that for Ukraine, especially given the devastation that it has gone through economically, not just in terms of infrastructure, repaying high-cost loans over the short term is going to be tremendously difficult. And it would be a crippling burden because that would actually make the budget more use its scarce resources for repaying loans rather than for the services that it provides. So part of the solution is, and we have laid this out in some of our work, is to think through a gradation of resources. First and most importantly, grants. I think grants are what the global community in the short run needs to provide. Lisa, you'll talk about this a bit, and I really want to applaud the US, who has really stepped forward in providing $7.5 billion in grants, pure grants for economic assistance in the short term. But grants are difficult for many countries right now, given the economic situation of the world today. So the next tier really has to be loans, but loans that are concessional, highly concessional to the market, right? And that's where organizations like ours and Marcus's comes in, because essentially these are not loans on market terms. Market terms for Ukraine right now are impossibly high, but they are concessional to market, under 2% a year, and very importantly, with a substantial grace period before Ukraine will have to repay it again. And let me make my third and final point. To the extent that the global community has grants that are not large enough, like the US contribution, a huge value proposition for those grants would be to actually buy back the terms of even the concessional loans, especially by having a longer grace period, 10 years, say, before Ukraine has to restart it. And then, with the economic growth that we hope that Ukraine will see, Ukraine will be in a position to pay back by itself without putting a huge burden.
Absolutely, absolutely. I'll let Marcus please add into that.
Yeah, sorry, I very much agree to what Arup said. I think there's different tiers. I think one other aspect I would like to bring to this is that on top of grants and loans, I think, of institutions like ours or the EBRD or others, I think there's also a crucial role to bring in the private sector investors in this. And that brings us then also to the accession process of Ukraine, or I don't know, the association of Ukraine to the European Union, because I think that is then related to what you said at the beginning, the technology transfer, but also the transfer of real financial resources of the private sector. And there's, I think, a role that we can also play as promotional banks to facilitate this, to structure this, to provide the confidence, and to catalyze these funds into Ukraine.
Absolutely, thank you. Marcus, I'd like to stay with you for a second, because the EIB has increased its investment in Ukraine following the Russian occupation of Crimea in 2014. And it knows the country well. And speaking in April, the EIB president, Werner Hoyer, said that Ukraine hasn't always been an easy partner. And even prior to the war, governance considerations were material to Ukraine's credit profile. Effective bureaucracy was a key factor in the success of the original Marshall Plan. So to what extent does this issue remain a barrier, potentially, to international cooperation in the reconstruction?
I think that's a very good question, because it's in everybody's mind. But I think there's two things, and of course, we, like with all partners, you always face some of the challenges that you work with, but we manage to work with many partners around the world. But I think there's two things that changed fundamentally going forward that make me very optimistic on this front. One is, I think the relationship of the Ukrainians with their government has changed dramatically in this war. I think it's sad, the occasion is very sad, but I think there is a different perception of the value of having these institutions, a different perception of being a country. It's not like I try to maximize my gains or I try to minimize the taxes I pay or other things. It's a clear understanding, and that I think has changed for very sad reasons, but it certainly has changed. And the other thing that is very important is this, is trying to link the reconstruction that hopefully we start, to my mind, even earlier than as early as possible, if not now, to link this with the prospect of joining the European Union, which provides a very strong anchor institutionally, which is a kind of a tested model of combining country ownership at the same time as being embedded in an overall institutional framework that allows to address the challenges that every democracy faces in critical situations like this. And I think with these two, I think Ukraine will be an even better partner than it was before the recent aggressions of Russia. So I think that's what makes us optimistic. At the same time, we all know, and our Ukrainian partners are the first to acknowledge, that this will be a massive challenge for all of us. And this will be a lot of flows. It's going to be very hard to make sure that the plans are consistent. It's going to be very hard that the little bit that we can give as international community, as much as it is, it will always be too little, given the needs that we just heard about. So we have to be very, very careful to make sure that every euro, every dollar is spent in the most efficient way and is well coordinated. But I think with these two things, a different attitude towards the government and embedding this and having this as an element of the EU process towards joining the EU, I think we have a very good chance to make this a success.
Excellent. I know there's a couple more comments from all the speakers here. I'll start with you, Wilhelm.
Well, first of all, I find it a wonderful sign of hope that we discuss recovery in the midst of the war. Yeah. Because this gives the impression that we are trustful, that we believe in Ukraine, having Ukraine as an independent and free country and as part of the European family. And Taras, I can just make a big applause or compliment what you are doing in this country. It's so impressive. You are putting a mirror in front of us and showing also us what we have to do. I find this extremely important. Second, talking about Marshall Plan, I'm coming from Austria. Austria, after the Second World War, was the country that was the most endangered by suffering and hunger and starving population. Marshall Plan was the key for making this Austrian story of success. And you will be surprised, Marshall Plan is still in place. We do have in Austria this European Recovery Program, ERP, that's still working. And I give you just a flavor what I think, and I would be very much interested also to discuss this, what is necessary to make it a story of success. And here we have to be crystal clear. First and foremost, we need a proper public structure and the public services in place. And here the link to the accession process is key. Second, don't underestimate, we need a clear list of priorities, what has to be done. And this is the most challenging thing for a Ukrainian government, a clear list of priorities. Because everything is necessary immediately, but we can't do everything at the same time. We need a clear list of priorities. Third, from the very beginning, please let us involve the private sector. It is not possible to do everything just by public money or grants. We need the private sector engaged in this, let's say, list of priorities. And fourth, let's not talk about either or. We should not talk about either grant or loans or either public or private. We need everything. Yeah. And the blending of the capacity of the public sector and the capacity of the private sector is key. And for that, these promotional institutions play a critical role. And one of the ideas could be that the Ukrainians are also creating a promotional bank to have the proper partnership in that. And last but not least, I think we should listen carefully what Ukrainians need. You have mentioned Tara steel sector. I think we should take into account agriculture. That's key for the country. We should take into account from the very beginning, not infrastructure just, but also SMEs, for instance, in Ukraine. And we should make also an approach that covers Ukraine as a country and not just, let's say, some areas. Because the question of equal distribution of aid and help is key to have the proper support of the Ukrainian people. These are just a few things, and I can just tell you, let's do it. Yeah. Full stop. Let's start it as soon as possible. And this is practically now.
Thank you. Lisa, to you, and then Arab, and then we'll go back to Taras to hear from him.
Yeah, thank you. So first of all, I mean, I'd like to, instead of maybe Marshall Plan for Ukraine, I feel more comfortable talking about it as the Ukraine plan, because as you know, the other panelists have noted, and as the Deputy Minister have noted, it has to be Ukraine-led. Yeah. The Ukraine people and the government of Ukraine need to identify the priorities among the priorities, because the challenges are huge, the needs are huge. For USAID, we are used to operating in multiple timelines. So on February 24, first day of the invasion, USAID immediately sent a disaster assistance response team on that very day. In the medium term, we're trying to assist small businesses, farmers to be able to maintain and continue their livelihoods, trying to assist the millions of internally displaced people who need some economic assistance as well as cash assistance. But in the long term, which is probably the hardest of all, is we need to keep our focus on what is the big goal, which is to ensure that Ukraine in the long term, as the Deputy Minister mentioned, has sustainable development. And that means supporting democratic governance and a market economy in Ukraine. And that is where we have, even through the invasion, we've continued our programs in Ukraine. We have about 700 staff of our implementing partners and 40 programs ongoing, because the reforms have to continue. And I have to say, Ukraine has actually made a lot of progress. We talked about accountability and transparency. We supported the government in developing an e-procurement system, Prozoro, and we also supported Dozoro, which is a civil society watchdog. And I think whether it's loans, grants, I mean, as that assistance comes in, it's very critical for accountability to come through, and it gives confidence not just in the international community, but more importantly to the people of Ukraine, that the money coming in is spent in direct benefit to the people of Ukraine. And the last point I'll make is on the private sector, which Mark, Arup, and Willem had said, you cannot attract private investment if rule of law, if the business policy environment are conducive to investment. So the long-term reforms are needed, and I know Ukraine is not waiting, and neither is USAID.
Thank you. Arup.
Let me be brief in the interest of conversation, but I really want to pull some of the points that were made together in terms of the private sector. And I think exactly as you said, that we need to quickly have private money flowing in. And a big part of that, therefore, going to the list of priorities, has to be the set of conditions that essentially de-risk the private sector. Some of that can be played by partners, right? The de-risking part, it can be insurance and others, but a big part of that is confidence in the rule of law, in corporate governance of the large state-owned enterprises that still dominate Ukraine, including in the financial sector. And I think that has to be a big part of the story of reconstruction that the Ukrainian government puts forward for the world. Because eventually, the longest term impact, as all the panelists have said, for Ukraine is a thriving private sector, Ukrainian private sector, but with foreign, European, American, global firms coming in and playing an important role in reviving the economy, providing jobs, alleviating poverty.
Absolutely, thank you. Taras, over to you.
Thank you. I just make a lot of remarks, but I think that we have a rather consolidated view and comprehensive view. So that first of all, I would like to highlight that actually the nature of our discussion about economic recovery is also a part of big solidarity. So it's not like our bill for please pay for the damages made by Russia. So for me, it's wrong, because this is a case for reparations. So that Russia should pay for the damages it is doing, and I hope that we will be at that moment when Russia will do reparations, because we all believe that Russia will lose this war. But this issue of recovery is a matter of solidarity, is a matter of, let's say, common vision of our goals, of sustainable development goals, whatever framework you will take. So Western values, market economy, or something more like more, let's say, bureaucratic UN sustainable development goals lists. So in all these areas, we actually together. So that's why this is a matter of economic and solidarity. So that's why this is the foundation of this pledge for recovery. So that's why it should be oriented on something more than just covering the damages caused by Russia. Second thing that I would like to highlight is that we already have a resilience of Ukrainian business that actually helps us a lot. So that banking system operates, communication operator, mobile operators works quite well. Ukrainian Railways is doing best in delivering goods into Ukraine, out of Ukraine, etc., etc. So that's why I think that this initial shock of war was actually we managed to go through it, and now these core elements of Ukrainian economy is operating, and this is a really good sign for everyone. So also for the early investments to come into Ukraine. So with your support, and as well, so that you know that Ukraine has really diversified economy with really strong connections to the private world. When we are talking about agriculture, for example, agriculture is actually a fourth which is built for many years together with American companies like Cargill or French companies like Soufflé and also Gulf countries like DP World, actually, Dubai port owning some capacities, and Saudi Arabia, Salik owning some land and in Ukraine as well. So that's why the agriculture in Ukraine is a symbol that it's not like state-owned. It's actually something global. So that a lot of companies invested a lot. So that's why official development partners like European Investment Bank or World Bank, and so it should be like they should be facilitators and help and some kind of like a guarantee for this private inflow to go into Ukraine. So sometimes we had a discussion, so that indeed Ukraine is not the most comfortable partner, especially when we are talking about corporate governance for state-owned enterprises and our constant fights with what we are thinking like a sovereignty or a better solution for better understanding for global world. But in reality, I think that what we are looking for is your support is actually in presenting us for the private world as a really vibrant and diversified economy. And what is really surprising me is that you helped me to understand that actually our bid for EU accession is not like a ultimate goal, but a necessary axiom for the success of this recovery. Because I agree with you, so that Ukrainian institutions, of course, we can be really happy that pandemia experience and communicating in WhatsApp with all my colleagues and deputy minister helped us in these early days of war. But in reality, sustainable institutions is what we need in order also to attract and to actually manage this big idea of economic recovery. Yeah. And in reality, I think just to conclude from what I said at the beginning, the idea of recovery is not just another plan for like development or support, so something we used to develop together with World Bank and USAID and Investment Bank. This is something new. This is a real political pledge to the world that we need something more, and not only in terms of scale, so billions, not only in terms of the cost, because the question of grants and loans is just a mere question of cost of these finances, but something like big intellectual investment into making this, let's say, final step for converging Ukraine with Western world finally completely, like this war actually detach us from Russia completely with no nuances or no discussions, because it's just simply they are enemies and we are fighting against them, but you are friends and you are our allies, and this economic pledge here is just like a final step for the economic convergence with our partners. Thank you.
Thank you, Taras. I have one question that I'd like to bring up now, because if we were to do a word cloud of a lot of the conversations that we've heard over the past couple of days, it's things like solidarity, collaboration, partnership, which are all, great sounding words, but let's talk about what that means in practice, because, and this has been alluded to, with rising food and gas prices, the possibility of a recession, many Western states are, I assume, focused on combating issues at home than on help for Ukraine. So beyond promises and commitments from Western leaders, how much political will and support from the populations really exist for such an exercise? Wilhelm, I'll start with you.
Well, first of all, we have to fight for that. That's by definition, because solidarity is not a given. By the way, nothing is a given currently. Fighting for solidarity means also fighting the war fatigue. This was a discussion about the last couple of days, and this is our obligation, full stop. I would make, Taras, two comments. The one is, I think we should really consider the strong link between the accession planning and stages and the recovery planning and stages. This is extremely important. And for that, I think a seconding is necessary. And this comes also to what GLOBSEC is planning to do. We are talking about money, and that's obvious that this is necessary, and I think we don't understand in full what's the amount really needed. It's in any case huge. But what Taras said, and I think we should go a bit deeper. Please give us also an indication where you need advice. Because the one thing is to have money, but the other thing is to spend money in the right direction for the right priorities in a proper manner. And I think this is something crucial that we can offer also, not just GLOBSEC, but many others. Besides money, it's also advice and giving, let's say, the right support. And this is for me a key thing. Just to close this means also, again, the connection between access, the process of accession to the European Union and the recovery planning, because this must be based also on intellectual capacity. And here we need also the clear requests from Ukraine. What do we need and when? One element we have not tackled, and I find this critical and important, we should talk also about social infrastructure, because this is something of urgency for a country post-war. Hospitals, schools, kindergarten, and all these things. And this is necessary also to convince the people in Ukraine.
Absolutely. Arab, over to you.
I really am glad you brought up the last point. And let me build a bit more on that. Eventually, I think too much of the conversation, and I've been part of many, on reconstruction has concentrated on infrastructure, including social infrastructure. But actually, it is about, as Taras, you put it brilliantly, about a vision for Ukraine's future.
Indeed.
And there is a lot to be done, especially in building Ukraine's and maintaining Ukraine's amazing human capital. So what you have in Ukraine, as all of you know, one of the things that we haven't talked about yet, is Ukraine a world leader? Yes, in agriculture, but also in technology, right? In the tech industry. Yeah. Ukraine has created as many unicorns as continental Europe over the last 3 years. This is a fact that's not actually well understood. So you have actually in Ukraine a tremendously strong infotech area, which is small, it's contained, and it's not broad. So part of the comparative advantages that Ukraine can build on is actually that. And there we do have a challenge. Ukraine's human capital, if you look at learning losses and gaps, is actually declining because Ukraine does not yet have a modern education sector. So part of the process of accession to Western values, to Western standards, has to be a really strong focus on restoring and even leapfrogging Ukraine's educational and technical capacities broadly across the population of Ukraine. And that will make Ukraine a powerhouse that we haven't actually talked about in traditional, apart from the traditional ways that we have talked about things.
Absolutely. I'd like to go back onto that political will side of things from the American, from the US perspective as well. So Lisa, from your perspective, you know, how much support do you feel there is from the US public?
I think it's very clear from the U.S. government, level, the support and the assistance, whether it's development, humanitarian, or military assistance. That's very clear. One of the things we also encountered, and even in the early days of the war, is just the amount of corporate interest as well in supporting Ukraine, and then. As in private, Ukraine is the soul of its country. Yeah. And there's nothing probably more dear to each and every one of us than the values we hold, on liberty and freedom and respecting the territorial integrity of a sovereign country. Yeah. So I think many of our friends in Ukraine have said they are fighting for the values that we hold dear. And this resonates, not just with somebody working in government, but, even with, our populations in communities, in rural areas in the United States. And I think that's why, if I may, with my European friends, it's also why Europe has come together in such a way that, probably not seen in the last few years. And we're very much working with the European Union. We're constantly coordinating and with the international financial institutions. In fact, Arup and I will have a lot to talk about after this forum.
Excellent. Marcus, over to you.
Yeah, I just want to come back to your original question. Is there enough support given the domestic challenges?
Yeah.
I think it is recognized that there is no trade-off. These domestic challenges are very much linked towards what's going on in Ukraine, and have